We are live. Hi, Dan. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Thank you, Grace. Excited to be here.
Okay, so this episode is brought to you by Verivend. If you're a GP or LP looking to simplify capital raising and deployment process, Verivend is here to help. Trusted by over 800 funds and managing more than $2 billion in transactions, Verivend offers a secure, streamlined payment platform designed specifically for private capital markets. Say goodbye to manual reconciliation and repeated follow-ups. Raise and deploy capital faster and with greater transparency. Ready to make your fund operation smoother? Visit Verivend.com and see how easy it can be. Okay, so to start the show, I would love for the audience to get to know you a little bit more. You started your career at General Atlantic, and then later on, you joined Notable. And why don't we start with like, what are some core lessons you've learned early on in your career that you kind of took into investing at Notable now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think early on in my career, I really started at GA out of college, and I had very little background on both the software industry and the investing industry. And I think what was really valuable about that experience is I got to see at GA a really wide variety of types of investments, types of investors, sectors, geographies, basically anything that was growth oriented and at a certain scale would fall under our mandate. And so I had the opportunity to just understand the way a lot of different people think and the way a lot of different people approach investing. And I think what I learned there was that, companies can succeed for a bunch of different reasons, but ultimately it comes down to the strength of the founders and the quality of the market and the product. And I think that what we saw across whether it was earlier stage investments there or very late stage investments there was that the best companies were led by amazing founders. And I think that as I started to move more and more into earlier stage investing and joining Notable, what I realized is that, to back great people, you need to build really strong relationships with them. And I think the biggest lesson that I've learned over the years is that, it's important to be sector focused. It's important to have a point of view on the market and to be able to help companies as they grow. But really, venture is a relationship business, and building great relationships internally within the firm that you're at, building great relationships with the founders that you're working with is what allows you to, make great investments and ultimately support companies as they grow.
Totally. I wonder, so like I'm actually, so before our chat, like I also dive into some of your some part of your blogs. I wonder, so like when you are writing blogs, like what are some like ways that for you to collect information? I'm sorry, this is like such a random topic from the personal
No, no,
growth
no.
part, but I was like literally like I'm because I feel like when I was like reading the blogs, I feel like uh obviously you talk about, so the most recent one is like the agent infrastructure one. So how do you actually summarize the key trends? Because I think sometimes when you chat with like 10 companies or like 20 or 40 companies, it's really easy for you to recognize something, but I don't know how to summarize it into how you kind of like summarize into trends. Is there any like kind of like note taking or kind of I guess like habit that you have to actually collecting the thoughts?
I wouldn't say I've nailed down process at this point. I do
Mhm.
think that one of the real privileges of this job is that you just get to meet really smart people all day. And,
Mhm.
when I dive into a new sector, I have the ability to get to know founders who wake up every day thinking about that problem and solutions that they're building to that problem. And so I think just
Mhm.
exposure to more and more of those people is always helpful. I think that when I'm
Mhm.
trying to understand a space, whether it's to write a blog or to develop a thesis internally, I try to collate both what founders are saying and founders are building, as well as try to get more of a customer perspective and understand sort of what's the problem as it's experienced today. And I
Mhm.
think that's a lot of what our process at Notable looks like. I think one thing we've
Mhm.
done a really good job of is, building relationships with not just the founders who are building companies, but also the practitioners who are actually adopting the software that the companies we're investing in are building. And I think that allows us both to, obviously support our companies as they grow, but more importantly, I think it allows us to understand, what are the real problems and get that from the source itself, as opposed to hearing it through the filter of how founders have internalized those problems and thought about building solutions to them. And
Totally.
so I generally try to get as many perspectives from both those audiences as I can. Um, I wouldn't say that I have amazing, I've tried out a bunch of these AI note-taking tools. I wouldn't say I've necessarily nailed the workflow yet, but usually I try to, get to a certain threshold of folks who have spoken to, get a real understanding of the space and then continually iterate and get their perspectives on drafts of things I'm writing or just ideas that of trends that I've put together over time.
Totally. Maybe we could dive into I guess like before we dive into the AI trends, why don't we start with like a quick background on Notable? Obviously, it's like Notable was originally from GGV, which is like a really big historical, very successful fund. Maybe we could talk about like the maybe a few things about like Notable, and then we can dive into the agentic trends. Um, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So Notable's been around really 25 years at this point. We were called GGV for most of our life. We did a bit of a rebrand a little over a year ago. But I'd say we continue to really focus on investing mostly at the early stage. I'd say most of what we do ends up being between seed and Series B. We tend to lead investments. We try to work very closely with our entrepreneurs. And we try to be pretty sector focused. So I really focus on everything infrastructure and security, along with a number of our partners. We also have folks focus more on kind of AI at the application layer, and then a team that focuses more on fintech and consumer. So those are kind of the core areas where we play in. We try to be very deep in those sectors, and we try to be meaningful partners to companies, starting at generally seed through Series B, and as they scale to and through IPO.
Totally. Okay, so maybe we could start with I feel like lately because of I just read the blog, so there's like have some recency bias. So like AI infrastructure moment. So basically you mentioned about like, it's democratizing post training. So why don't we start with like, in the agentic infrastructure space, what are some key trends, and then how do you kind of like think of the investable sector within these like key trends?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the way we think about it is in two components. I think that one, we're trying to invest in, the next primitives for AI agents and for AI agent builders as they're kind of bringing those AI agents to market. And I think the other side of the coin is we're trying to invest in sort of the people who are building those agents for sectors that we care about. And so I think on the first side, broadly, our view is that this is a type of application that's very different from traditional applications. Agents are oftentimes ephemeral. They need to be spun up and down very quickly. They're interacting with websites, browsers, MCP servers, different types of tools than previous software was. They're inherently non-deterministic, and so you need to understand what they're doing and put guardrails around them. And so those are all sort of opportunities for new infrastructure to come in to become sort of a core part of how you build the next generation of software. And so I think one area we've tried to spend a lot of time in is, what are the compute and storage requirements for these new agents? If you think about cloud software for a long time, people used some kind of compute from AWS, whether it be EC2 or Lambdas or something else. They oftentimes use a database. Those databases have evolved over time. But the requirements for these agents are actually very different. We are investors in a company called Neon that provides a serverless Postgres database. And that company was really born to focus on kind of broadly serverless cloud workloads. But what they did is they were able to build this novel architecture that allows these databases to get started very quickly from sort of nothing to significant amounts of traffic very fast. It allows them to also branch the database very quickly, so you can make small changes to the database, replicate it without having to go through this big migration process. And it allows them to scale up and down with the traffic very efficiently. And originally, that was very valuable for a traditional cloud workload, but what people saw is that with agents, you're oftentimes waking up an agent when it needs to do some work. So scaling to zero and scaling from zero is very valuable. Those agents might do nothing and then get a ton of traffic very quickly. So that scalability is very good. And branching is important because you might want to make these small changes to agents. And so effectively what we saw is that very quickly, the usage of Neon went from 100% humans building these databases to 80% AI agents building these databases. And so I think there's going to be more opportunities like that to build these kind of foundational components of sort of cloud infrastructure for agents. Neon last week announced they were being acquired by Databricks, and I think a lot of the motivation there was to serve these agentic workloads. And so we see a ton of opportunity there.
I wonder maybe if you could like walk us through, like for example, a Neon or like any of your portfolio company on how you kind of like find them in the first place. Just because I know that Neon founder is like a second time founder. He was like very successful before this, and I also like another of your portfolio company actually went on our show as well, Jim Security. Yeah. So maybe if you could like give us a little background, like for example, for these like founders, like how do you kind of like, first of all, like do you have prefer maybe second time founders, or like I think for Jim it was like the founder was like in the Israeli like intelligence ecosystem, and like how do you program in the special force basically. So how do you think about like identify the founder in the first place, and then how do you validate or like diligence, what does a diligence process look like for you to like make you feel comfortable about the product they're building to scale to billions of dollars?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that great founders can come from a lot of different places, and I can give you perhaps a couple examples that maybe show that range. With Nikita and Neon, we had invested in Vercel in 2021, and we just saw the massive wave of serverless computing coming, and we saw that people needed a serverless database to complement sort of the websites and web apps that they were putting on Vercel. And so my colleague Glenn and I really just started looking into the space in a lot of depth and trying to meet everybody and anybody who is building a company in that space. And so we sort of saw Neon as an open source project on Hacker News and reached out to Nikita. And it was a little bit of, love at first sight, in that we'd spent so much time thinking about this. He had spent so much time thinking about this, and there was kind of instant alignment. And obviously his reputation is so strong from his time at Single Store that became sort of an easy one to get comfortable with. There are other very different examples as well. I'll give an example of Torque, which my colleague Oren initially met Eldad, one of the founders, at a conference in Vegas. I think they met around a craps table and just hit it off as people. And that's obviously very important. And at the time, Eldad and Ofer and Leonid were building a different company called Illuminate. And we were very interested in that company. That company ultimately got acquired before we could invest in it. And so we just stayed in touch over time and were able to see sort of how these folks operated, both in their first company, after the company was acquired, and as they started the second company. And once they started the second company, I think we had known them for a while and really got conviction that, these are people that we believe can build something bigger and better this time, that have real domain expertise around security, that have been around the block for a while and understand the market. And are poised to build something really big. And so that's sort of one where we had the benefit of getting to know the founders over time, getting to see how they operate, and that also makes the decision a whole lot easier.
I wonder, so like for example, when I guess like so you also, I saw on the on LinkedIn you also built like InvestInData. I guess it's kind of like an exact network. So how do you think about like the diligence process? Let's say your partner meet them, and then also you mentioned like for Neon, it's like you already have a thesis on like serverless database would be like a huge trend. Like, and I guess how do you think about like diligencing it? Like what does the diligence process look like for you? Is it like you talk to, let's say, 60 executive in the exact space to ask them if they will buy Neon product, or like how do you, I guess, like get comfortable with it? And then what would you ask these executives? Because there's, you could just ask them like, hey, would you buy this? But like people would just give you like a really general answer. But how do you kind of like narrow down like on, I guess like the profile that people would actually consume?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's something we're always trying to iterate on and improve on. We've built a lot of these exec networks so that we can get close to smart people who are either subject matter experts in areas that we care about or potential buyers of the types of software that we invest in. And so I think as a result, kind of the customer perspective has become very important to us as we think about investing. And that looks very different depending on the stage. I think oftentimes you're making a seed bet really on the back of kind of a vision and how strong you think a founder is. And it can be pretty hard to validate, like, will people buy a product when the product doesn't yet exist? I think as companies are later stage, what we try to do is spend time with the customers of the product. And I think we also try to get the perspective of people who we sort of know and trust. So to your point, sending people neon.com and asking them like, hey, is this something you would buy, gets you pretty limited information. And to be honest, what I found is that going to expert networks as well can get you pretty limited information, and pretty generic information that all of your competitors are going to see. And so we've tried to think about how do we improve the fidelity of the customer feedback that we're getting. I think part of that is actually having relationships with the people who are looking at this software and are giving you their perspective. Because once you get to know people, you can get to know that, hey, some of these folks are kind of positive in general. They tend to love to try new software. And so them saying like, hey, this thing is really cool is a great signal, but might not necessarily be as good a signal as someone who is sort of negative on almost everything, but is positive on the potential of something that you're diligencing and showing them for the first time. And so I think understanding those biases really only comes from long-term relationships with these sorts of folks and, bringing them value as well, as opposed to constantly just pinging them and asking them for favors.
For sure. I really like what you said about like a lot of the work that you still have to do on your own instead of just like leaning towards like people's feedback 100%. And maybe we could talk about like some of your other portfolio company like Fall. I feel like I see Fall popping up on my LinkedIn feed a lot. It is like a generative media platform for developers. Maybe if you could give the audience a little bit background on like, the subject area, and then maybe we could talk about like how you meet Fall.
Yeah, for sure. Generative media, I think, has been blowing up since the Stable Diffusion launch and really the DALL-E launch, which I want to say was mid 2022. And what people saw is there's been this kind of step function improvement in the ability to create both text to image, text to video, image to video, text to audio types of models, basically new media models that are entirely AI generated. And what Fall is really doing is providing an inference platform that allows folks to build with these models in ways that are better, faster, and cheaper. So you can go on Fall, you can access almost every model that exists in the generative media space. And a bunch of customers like, Shopify and Perplexity and Adobe and many others are now embedding these models into their products and creating net new product experiences using these sorts of models that, whether that be, allowing people to generate images on their platform, allowing people to edit images on their platform, broadly using this new technology to create delightful user experiences. And what Val really differentiates on is both the breadth of the models that they're able to provide and also sort of the ease of use and the optimization. So really what they provide is the fastest, cheapest models on the market with the best ease of use, which means that if you're building with these models, you can create a much better end user experience because of the speed, and you can integrate it much more quickly because of the developer experience that they're offering. And really what we've seen is that it's an amazing convergence of incredible founders who sort of have a differentiated ability to execute in the space with a market that is just growing like crazy. I don't know if you saw the Google VO3 announcement yesterday, but Google's sort of a close partner with Val. And just seeing the quality of that model versus the quality of VO2, which came out only a few months ago, is pretty remarkable. And so Val is really benefiting from the continued innovation in the space.
For sure. Can I ask so how do you think about the business model around like models? So is this maybe if you could give the audience a little bit of background, like do people charge based off like the usage, or is this more of like I negotiate a deal with Google and Google pay us X amount as like a project / like service fee, or like how does a business model kind of work in the model space?
Yeah, I think it's different for every type of model and every type of inference platform. For Val, they're hosting these models, and so customers pay them for the usage. And basically, the way I think about the economic arrangement is that hosting these models yourselves is really complex, and you're probably not going to do as good a job in terms of price, latency, and performance as Val does. And so I think there's pretty clear ROI for folks who are trying to build with models to go to a third party that's really laser focused on this and best in class at running this type of model. What we're also seeing is that for large enterprises, I mean, this space is changing day to day. And so for them, contracting with a model provider directly or betting on one, whether it be open or closed source model directly, is actually pretty risky because in 2 weeks, a new model could come out and now you sort of need to readjust and switch, or you're stuck with a less than state of the art model. And so I think FAL is a really valuable platform in that you can go to them and say, hey, I just want access to all of the models and adjust as needed or build sort of multi-model workflows.
Mm-hmm.
I think on the flip side, for the model providers, it's really an exceptional distribution platform, as well as a way for them to reach customers without having to build all this infrastructure that's very hard to build, very hard to scale, very hard to operationalize, but critical to them as they're trying to, grow their business.
For sure. I'm hearing, so like, I guess like when you mentioned about the video model or like the media model, so like it seems like latency is something that's important, and then inference. So like, how do you think about in your mind like these different models in the market? Like, what's their kind of like differentiation? Because like these days, like I feel like maybe because I'm from China, like I constantly hear about Manus or DeepSeek, and then in the US there is the OpenAI of the world, and then there is Vol. And like, how do you think about in your mind, like these different models, like differentiation, and then what would you say is like the top 3 benchmark to judge the model's like functionality?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that there's a bunch of different benchmarks that exist. And you can look at the FAL leaderboard, which I think has gives you a very good sense of the quality of different image and video models. I think that what's interesting to me about the generative media space, when you compare it to LLM and other sort of more text-based models, is that there's much more subjectivity in the aesthetics. You look at something like Ideogram versus Midjourney versus Pika. I think you can argue on specific quality and ability to adhere to prompts, but oftentimes what makes people choose one over the other is really their aesthetic choices. And I think that creates a much more diverse marketplace than, say, in large language models, because you might want to use a different model for different use cases, or you might want to use a combination of models depending on what sort of aesthetics you're going for, what sort of price range you have, what sort of latency is important to you. And so I think of it less as like, this is going to be winner take all and somebody's going to crush a benchmark and create, the world eating image or video model, and more that folks are just going to have a much wider range of models that they can pull from and use in order to build customer experiences that are really wowing.
I wonder for the media models, like go to market strategy, like what does it kind of look like? Because you see the Pika, which is like, they just launched like a really amazing video, and then it just kind of taking off. And then there is, I guess like the OpenAI of the world, they just literally do a lot of like these, like, I guess consumer, like you just Photoshop, like not Photoshop, but like, I guess like you create these like kind of cartoon character of yourself, or all these like really interesting launch strategies. And I guess like you mentioned about like aesthetic, like it's like a big thing, as well as like latency and like just price range. And I wonder, so like what do you think is like the best go-to-market strategy for a media model?
I think it depends on what the company wants to achieve. I think what you see is some of these companies want to be consumer platforms themselves. Some of them want to be more API providers. Some want to be both. And so, I think if you want to be a consumer experience, it's hard to reach scale without some kind of viral moment. And thankfully, the Twitter sphere and generally the technology industry, I think, is at a point where folks are really eager to try new things. And so we are seeing that best-in-class models are kind of bubbling to the top. I think that what's interesting about FAL specifically is by becoming almost this marketplace between the model providers and customers, it's become a really good distribution platform for folks who want to build APIs and reach developers. Because there are millions of developers already on FAL. And so you can plug in and again, this is an audience that really likes trying new things. And so, folks can plug into FAL, get some distribution benefit from day one, and start to get that kind of viral loop going with more word of mouth among the developer community.
I wonder, so like when you are thinking about like, I mean, I'm not thinking like, so I guess like how do you think about the exit of these different companies? So for example, Neon got bought by Databricks for quite a amount of money. And like how do you think about I guess how do you envision each company exit? Obviously the best case scenario is like the company went public and all that kind of stuff. But how do you I guess like since you come from I guess growth stage software internet investing background, like how do you think about the exit of companies when you invest in them?
I think when we invest in companies, ultimately our hope is that they'll become IPO ready at some point.
Mhm.
And so what that means to us is that there's a team that can actually scale a company to be that big, both in terms of their sort of desire and their abilities, and also that there's a market that can support it and a product strategy that allows them to compound over time and build a differentiated advantage. Now, not all those companies get there for a variety of reasons. I think
Mhm.
in the case of a company like Neon or Gem, you know, they were relatively early in their journey and had the opportunity to work with a much larger platform to build something even bigger,
Mhm.
and got offers that were frankly very compelling relative to the stage of the company. And we certainly will always support entrepreneurs if that's the decision that they want to make. And look,
Mhm.
some companies don't ultimately reach the scale to get to an IPO and need to find a home somewhere. Um, and so I think that part of what we try to do is ensure that we're backing companies that can get big. I think another part of
Mhm.
what we do is try to think about what is actually strategic. And I think that's part of why we're sector focused, because I think we're focused on areas that are truly strategic and important to the growth of the technology industry and the growth of the economy broadly. And that creates a much richer M&A environment, in my experience.
Mm. I wonder, so like since speaking of like I feel like some of your portfolio companies are I guess you invest in a later stage. For example, Vercel, like it's a very popular platform. And how do you evaluate, I guess, like the growth trajectory after they receive like a certain type of traction already? And I guess like also Vercel is like very, I guess like competitive company for investors to like invest in. Like how do you I guess like position yourself to like win the deal?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think maybe to start with the second part of your question on positioning, I think that's where focus and track record end up really mattering. Um,
Mhm.
and I give a lot of credit to my colleague Glenn, who has been investing in open source and has been one of the leading investors in open source for more than 10 years now. And so when we first got to know Guillermo at Vercel, we were able to point to companies like HashiCorp and Kong and many others that we'd helped really go from this open source led strategy to more of a scaled enterprise go to market. And that's something that I think lands really well with founders. In terms of the growth trajectory, when you're investing in a company at a billion or multi-billion dollar valuation, in order to see real venture like returns, you ultimately need to underwrite a very historic growth path. You need to underwrite companies that grow in line with the best software companies ever, and that can be something that's hard to do. So I think for us, that means going back to what do you believe is truly special about this business. And in the case of Vercel, you have a really visionary founder who's able to both kind of lay out the strategy, execute on the strategy on the product side, but also really bring the market forward as a persona and as a marketer. I think you saw a tremendous groundswell of developer love to the product, and our view was that those two things would come together and allow for a go-to-market strategy that would be very efficient and growth that would be in line with some of the fastest growing companies ever. And thankfully, I think that's proven out over the years that product velocity for sales has been exceptional. The sales leadership has been exceptional, and I think they've been able to really accelerate this market beyond even where we expected.
For sure. I wonder why do you pick infrastructure and security versus like agentic AI or like I guess like vertical?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think infrastructure underlies everything in the technology industry. And so it's an opportunity for us to look at what's happening in the world and provide the picks and shovels to that. And I think what we find is that as the world gets more digital, gets more AI centric, gets more cloud centric, the challenges in infrastructure and security only compound, become more numerous and more important. And that just creates, I think, a very rich sort of field for you to play in, and so many new opportunities for entrepreneurs to build really big businesses. And I think also these things aren't necessarily distinct. Like we've invested in some fantastic companies that are using agentic AI for security. I think Torque is probably the highest profile of those, which has built an incredible agentic AI platform for the SOC. And what we see is that you're basically able to apply these new technologies into one of the highest value and most expensive components of an enterprise's broader workforce, just given how hard it is to hire best-in-class talent in infrastructure and security.
Wait, sorry. I think there's some latency on the video. Wait, I have a question on so for example, since you guys invest in between C to Series B, what does a portfolio construction look like for you guys? Since I feel like the different, I guess Vercel is Series C and D too. So how do you think about portfolio construction when it comes to investing in earlier stage and later stage companies altogether?
I think we tend to be fairly bottoms up in the way we think about the world. So we're trying to see a lot of interesting opportunities and bubble up the ones that we think are most compelling. And there are times when those are seeds, and there are times when those are Series A's, and there are times where those are Series B's or C's. And so I think the flexibility really allows you to take a deep look at a market and understand what is the most compelling way for us to invest right now. In the case of something like Vercel, I think we had spent a lot of time in serverless software and in sort of the future of front end, and we saw that we thought there was a real runaway winner in the space. And despite the fact that it was a little later than where we typically invest, it made sense because we saw sort of venture returns at that scale. I think in other cases, what we see is we just meet incredible entrepreneurs. I spend a lot of time in the security ecosystem in Israel, and really the more time you spend there, the more access you get to really incredible entrepreneurs at the early stages of their journey. And for a long time, we were mostly investing at Series A in security in Israel. I think that as we got more comfortable with the market and with the people who we were spending time with, we were able to take kind of the leap and go into seed investing and really support those companies going from seed to moving and building go-to-market in the US and ultimately scaling from there.
Totally. I wonder, so since you mentioned about security and one of your most recent blog or Substack is about identity crisis, maybe if you could give us some overview on in 2025, what are some security trends that you think are happening in the security investing space, and then what are something that you are personally interested in right now?
Yeah, security moves so quickly that it feels like every year there's exciting new things happening for us to invest in. A couple that I'm interested in, I think one, we've been thinking a lot about how agents play into security. And there are a couple areas that are interesting to us there, but I think probably the most interesting at the moment is really what I mentioned around the agent impact on the SOC team. If you think about it, SOC teams or security operations teams are oftentimes the first line defenders and responders within a security team. And they're frankly just overwhelmed by the amount of work. There's so many more attacks than there used to be. There's so much more data coming to them that it can be really hard to understand and actually act upon the alerts that they're getting. And frankly, there's just not enough people to really do an effective job there without some significant form of automation. And so ultimately that's why we were so excited about backing Torque, is their ability to help folks automate those workflows. And what we see now is that, the company was started a few years ago, they allowed folks to build automated workflows to really support their SOC operations. And now they're applying LLMs and agentic AI to that world in order to create a sort of fully autonomous hyper-SOC, where it's not just, you create automations and write rules and we'll sort of run those as playbooks, but actual agents that understand the context of your enterprise, that understand the context of alerts that are coming in, and that allow you to much more effectively create automations and reduce the stress on the people in your organization.
Mm. When I guess like for the security companies like selling process, um, do you think people primarily just like decided to go for the CISOs, or like how does the go to market motion kind of look like for a typical security AI company?
I think it depends a little bit on the company. What I find is that the CISO is usually the decision maker and the budget holder in
Mhm,
most cases. And so involving the CISO matters a lot. And I think that's why we've invested a lot as a firm on building relationships with CISOs. But usually the person actually using the tool and ultimately influencing that decision might be someone else.
mhm,
So in the case of Torque, I think one thing they did really well is focusing tightly on the SOC persona as someone they can help with.
mhm,
They've built an amazing marketing machine, and really done some interesting things around differentiating and creating marketing that can be a little bit shocking or jarring when you walk the RSA 4,
mhm,
seeing skulls and monster trucks, but that reflects a deep understanding of who the persona is who lives within that SOC and who uses the product and deals with these problems all day. And
mhm,
so what I find is that the best companies I think are able to appeal to the CISO with a really clean pitch,
mhm.
but also become sort of a life-saving tool for somebody else within a security team and something that they're willing to really, really advocate for and can kind of market to both personas as a result.
Mm. I wonder, so since you mentioned about the RSA, like what are some trends that you're seeing in the RSA that you find interesting?
I think like everywhere else, AI is all over the place. I think AI applied to SOC, AI applied to identity, that's
Mhm,
been a big, big trend. Um, I think that, it's much harder to differentiate than it used to be in the security world. There are so many security companies out there. And that's why I think we get so excited when we meet a team that's actually able to, build a brand that looks different from everything else out there. You know, the Torque team literally brought a monster truck onto the RSA 4 this year, and that grabs a lot of eyes. And it also speaks to kind of a brand identity that is very different from what any other company in security has.
mhm,
And so I think what we see is just more competition is breeding
mhm.
more ingenuity in the way folks think about going to market, which I think is very exciting for us.
Mm. I wonder, so like since I guess like when you so I'm just like currently looking at the blog that you wrote last year. So there's like a lot of like authentic so I guess like I wanted to ask about like, maybe if you could walk us through in the security space, like what are something that's you feel how does I guess like how does the industry the how does the money flow in the industry? And then like why do you feel like, you want to start with the SOC 2 related subsector?
You're asking how does the money flow like to startups or
So I guess,
broadly?
like, how do you identify, like, which part that I guess a CISO would spend the most amount of money on? Because there's, like, authentication, there is, like, other different, subsector in the space. I guess, like, how do you identify, like, which part would, I guess, the CISO spend the most amount of money to, like, how you kind of, like, identify the company in the space that will actually make the most amount of money in that particular space?
Yeah, got it. That's a really interesting question. I think that typically we see a couple sources of big budget within security. I think
Mhm,
one is kind of a net new type of workload comes online and needs to be secured. And so I think cloud is the perfect example of this, where you know folks weren't deploying cloud, then over a 5 or 10 year period, they started deploying a lot of cloud workloads, and
mhm,
they needed new tools in order to secure what was big spend. And so that's kind of a bucket of really big evergreen um, or really big greenfield spend on security products. And I think that's what allows companies like Orca and Wiz and others to grow very, very quickly in
mhm,
a new market. I think the other one that we think about is what are existing buckets of spend that people are really unhappy with. So just look at what does a typical budget look like and what's the NPS on those products. And then we try to think through, well, what are the switching costs to something better that is new and better? And so if I look at the SOC, there's a lot of spend typically around a SIM where you're storing all of your security data. That can be a very difficult market to go after just because there's a ton of data gravity and migrating data is very hard. And then there's oftentimes a lot of spend around the SOAR, which is kind of a security orchestration product that allows you to build automations. And what we saw is that a lot of those tools are very old, very hard to use, and it's easier to switch there than kind of at the data layer. And so I think that's kind of a Goldilocks zone for us, where you're able to find large bucket of spend, switching costs that are reasonable, products that people don't, incumbents that people don't like, and an amazing team who's going after it.
How do you, I guess, like, do you actively, so for example, I feel like on this graph, like the Stitch founder was also on our show. So for, I guess like at the beginning, I think like in our episode, we kind of like talk about like Okta and Stitch back then. So like, I think like what do you think about the passwordless approach in that space?
Yeah, we're investors in a company called Dscope in that space that I think has created some very interesting passwordless technology and some interesting technology that allows folks to integrate passwordless into their software. Look, I think passwordless we see more and more data breaches, more and more phishing attacks, more and more sophisticated hacks, especially with AI, where attackers can really, hyper target folks with information they find online, with deep fakes, with the use of voice models to make calls that sound like real people. And so I think more secure authentication tools are more critical than ever. I think one thing that's been challenging is that for large consumer platforms, it's hard to roll out passwordless in one day. I think that if you have 10 million users, telling them one day, like, hey, no more passwords, you need to go through this new authentication method, that actually creates a lot of friction. And friction for consumer companies ultimately means lost revenue because your customers are going to be unhappy. They might use your product less. You're creating this sort of really challenging dynamic for yourself. And so you need to think about how do you balance friction with security. I think that's what Dscope has done really well, both in that they allow customers to kind of orchestrate different types of authentication methods. So you can make things more challenging and more secure or less secure depending on who exactly is accessing it. I think they've also enabled folks to like roll out passwordless over time. So I think that's really one fear that we hear from customers is like, hey, passwordless is great, but if I roll it out once, especially me as a security team, my board or my counterparts in our marketing team or whatever it might be are going to be really mad because it's going to affect their results. And so I think finding that balance has been tricky, but I've been really impressed with the way that Dscope and some other companies have been navigating it.
I wonder, so I want to switch gear a little bit about like I guess cloud space. So I see a lot of company are trying to do I wouldn't say Airbnb for GPUs, but like I guess like some sort of like GPU like like it's not provider, but it's kind of like marketplace for GPUs, or like marketplace for, yeah, I think marketplace for GPUs. So I guess like, do you feel like there's money to be made in that space? Because I feel like there is already the Together AI or like some other big company in that space. And I guess like, why do you feel like people are building in that space? I don't know if it's considered as like infrastructure, but I guess it's adjacent-ish.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting space to see play out. I mean, I think the demand for GPUs has kind of been the rising tide that lifts all boats, and anybody in the GPU sales space, I think, has benefited from just a historic amount of demand. And so, look, I think, WeWork or Airbnb for GPUs, like, doesn't sound like an amazing business model on paper, but I think that is underestimating what some really smart entrepreneurs can do in this space. Because the way I think about it is that, sure, like making a margin on buying and selling GPUs is going to be difficult over time, especially as the market normalizes. But if that's sort of a way for you to get in and ultimately you can provide differentiated software on the training side for inference, better optimizations on how those GPUs are used, then that actually can build a sustainable business over time. What I've seen is that running GPUs is really hard. Running them efficiently is really hard, whether it's for training or inference workloads. And so my belief is that most companies are not going to want to do that in-house. They're going to want to go to some provider, not just for access to GPUs, but also for software that allows them to use the GPUs efficiently. And so I think that if you're building some kind of marketplace and you're able to provide that software on top of it, will it look exactly like a software company over time? I'm not so sure. But I think you can build really valuable companies and you get the benefit of building into this massive tailwind.
What do you think about like Airbnb for GPU? So like for example, if people don't own the GPU themselves, like it won't have like a huge budget to spend on that, but they just like crowdsource that. So for example, if there's company that purchased GPU, but like they're not like really in use, and then they were like listed on top of it, and then there's like a software power to that. Do you feel like there is a big market for that?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that when people say that, they mostly mean like accessing GPU capacity at data centers, less so accessing GPU capacity that's like in somebody's home or in an enterprise somewhere. I do wonder if you can really like serve important workloads with very, very distributed GPU clusters. I probably don't know enough about the technology to have a strong point of view on it. And so like Airbnb in terms of I'll have a GPU in my home and it's going to make some money for me because I'll rent it out. I'm not sure I believe in that, but I think like companies that live in between the data center and the folks who are accessing GPUs, I think can generate a lot of value if they're able to build software on top of it.
Want to switch gear a little bit. So like, Cursor. So yesterday I was at a talk, the Cursor CEO was like talking about building products. So like, first of all, like what's your thought process on like, they are the company that like, only existed for 2 years. They're already valued at like $9 billion. How do you, as a VC, like what's the thought process on like, what does that mean for like the rest of the companies? And do you feel like seat strapping is like actually a thing or not?
I think what it means for the rest of the companies, look, Cursor is incredible. It's an incredible product. The growth is kind of unprecedented, just how fast they're growing and at what scale. And I think that the lesson to me and to other VCs is that we're at a moment in time where people are willing and able to adopt new technology really, really quickly. And so if you really strike a chord with the market, there's a lot of growth ahead of you. To what extent do you want to assume that when you're doing a seed or a series A? I think that's where things get difficult. Like, does the 1% chance that a company becomes a Cursor mean that all seed and series A valuations should be higher? I tend to believe not, but I think it's reflective of the type of outcome that both progress on the technology side with models and sort of such a receptive market creates. And that's an important lesson because it reminds you sort of just how big this trend is going to be and how big these outcomes can be. On the seed strapping side, sorry, go ahead.
No, keep going. Sorry. I have a follow-up question later.
Yeah, no worries. I think on the seed strapping side, we still don't see it at most companies. I think that it's possible, again, if you hit some level of virality pretty quickly. What I find is that it's beneficial to raise venture capital for a bunch of reasons, even if things are going really well after a seed, whether it's to bring smart folks around the table, to bring some validation to the company as you're selling to enterprises, to help you as you recruit. All those sorts of things tend to be valuable, even if things are going really well. So I'd imagine we're going to see some of it. How much of it we're going to see in kind of traditional software, I'm still pretty skeptical.
So since like OpenAI like tries to, I guess it's already acquired Windsor for like $3 billion. Like, and then I believe like I read a bunch of like TechCrunch articles on like they kind of like try to acquire Cursor, but it kind of failed. So I guess like why wouldn't they just build it in-house versus like, they spend $3 billion on buying one of those companies?
Yeah, I think it's always hard to know why companies build versus buy. I think that you can always make the argument like we have a ton of money, we have really smart people, we can build this in-house. At the same time, like how often do we see these large companies actually build effective competitors to small startups in-house? I think it's not as frequent as you might expect, and it's
Mhm.
just a little bit of sort of cultural difference and motivation difference. And so I think partially I think what motivates every kind of technology acquisition is talent,
Mhm.
and the Windsurf team's exceptional. And so bringing them into OpenAI with the momentum that they have, I think makes a ton of sense. I think that the independent brand probably has some benefit to OpenAI as well. They can kind of continue to ride the momentum of the Windsurf brand, and then over time bake in sort of the right components of OpenAI. Marry Codex, the agent that they put out, with the IDE in a way that's
Mhm.
natural over time and not sort of as forced for the
Mhm.
user. Um, I think I've heard some folks speculate on the data advantage as well. Like even at this point with less than a year on the market, Windsurf has a ton of data on how people are using AI to complete their code or to edit their code. And that data is very valuable from a model training perspective to OpenAI. And so I think that alone justifies at least some price tag. And then when you include sort of the momentum of the business plus the team that you're acquiring, I can see how they kind of got to that $3 billion number.
Mm. I wonder, so like when you're thinking about like evaluating companies, so for example, yesterday I think the Cursor CEO were like really emphasizing on building a good product. And then also had like the Cluely founder on the show. So like those are the people who drop out of Columbia and
Yeah.
spending, like 150K on an ad. So like obviously they're very successful as well at like, creating buzz and stuff like that. So like they're hiring 50 interns to focus on marketing and all that kind of stuff. So, what's your thought process on like should people be building a better product first versus like marketing first, slash like go to market or like building up a distribution?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it has evolved over time. I still tend to believe that you need to build go to market and distribution that's the right fit for your product, particularly
Mhm.
in the software space. And
Mhm.
it's hard to know what that is until you understand the product. We
Mm.
work with some companies with ACVs of 50K, and we work with some companies with ACVs of 250K. And that requires a very different type of marketing team, a very different type of sales team, a very different sort of orientation. Um, and I think it's hard to know, which of those do you need? Do you need mostly inside sales? Do you need mostly field sales? Do you need more sort of PLG until you understand kind of how the product works, how the product is adopted, what's sort of the time to value, what's the ROI calculation on the part of your customers. And so can you build these things in parallel? I think it's possible. And I think what we see is more and more folks are just putting out products and then iterating on both the product and the messaging over time, which is very smart. But I think at least in more traditional software,
Mhm.
it's hard to know the go-to-market that you need until you've actually built out a product to some extent.
Mm. I wonder for the, I guess like for the valuation of these companies, like I guess like I see the marketing first mentality because of like a lot of the companies are just having a lot of buzz. Maybe they have a equivalent or competitor that are less focusing on the marketing, they might win. But does this even happen in the infrastructure space? Just because I think if you're marketing to a developer, it's very different than marketing to the mass, right? So like, how do you think about what are some like effective strategy for like the infrastructure company to kind of build up a distribution besides like generally open source?
Yeah, I think open source is a strategy, but it's reflective of the fact that developers like when you sort of show, don't tell.
Hmm.
And so I think that when I look at like the DevRel teams at the
Hmm.
best companies that we work with, folks,
Hmm.
companies like Vercel and others, what they do really well is that their DevRel teams aren't really marketers or writers, they're really builders. And so what they're doing is
Hmm.
they're building projects all the time and they're showing people these cool projects that they're building. And part of what's in those projects are the products that they're trying to evangelize and sell to folks. And so that's why I think it's harder to sort of bullshit your way to distribution. Um, in the developer tools space is because ultimately people are going to try your product and they're going to try to get value out of it. And what they care most about is, can you cut through all of the marketing speak and can you actually show them something that's super valuable? And so that's why I think that what we see is it's not necessarily reflective. Companies' reach and distribution quality isn't necessarily always reflective of how much money they're spending on marketing. It's oftentimes more of a how than a what.
Do you actively track GitHub stars of the companies that you are interested in?
Yeah, we do. We track GitHub stars in general. Like if any project is adding enough GitHub stars, it's going to come across our radar. I think that it's, politely, I'd put it politely and say it's an imperfect metric. I think that increasingly it's more and more BS. I think since especially this kind of AI and LLM wave, we see so many more companies reaching significant scale of GitHub stars that don't really have any production usage. And so we try to look for other signals, but it's still helpful to understand kind of what is top of mind for developers.
I guess like what is the GitHub benchmark? Is it like 8,000 or like what is the metrics that you feel like are kind of like matter to you?
I think it depends quite a lot on what the project is. Like a database reaching 5,000 stars and some kind of JavaScript tool reaching 5,000 stars is pretty different things. It's much harder to deploy one of those things than the other. Not to say that GitHub stars are reflective of how many people use this product in production, but I think that we try to sort of handicap things by what's the total audience of developers who could use this thing. So obviously like JavaScript, TypeScript, front end is naturally going to have more GitHub stars than anything that's built in Rust, more backend oriented, more distributed system centric. And so I think for some of those projects, like I think when we invested in Neon, there was maybe 4,000 or 5,000 stars on the project, which wouldn't be a lot if it was something that was more focused on kind of a front end community, but it's quite a lot for a very quiet project that is building a new database.
I wonder, so like I want to be mindful of time. So maybe we do one real question and then a quick 1 minute fire round. So I wonder, since you, I feel like you're very active in New York and the Israel startup community. What's the difference between these three big hubs, like SF, New York, and Israel?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that I think about a lot, just spending a lot of time in all three places. SF is still the global capital of technology, and that's even more true than in the AI world than prior to it. And so I think that what you see is just tremendous scale and a lot of different networks that have converged. And if I compare that to Israel, Israel is really like one network. What's amazing is that you sit in a cafe in Tel Aviv and you see almost everybody in the ecosystem. It's really remarkable, just the proximity. And so I think once you're embedded in the ecosystem, you start to really get a sense of everything that's going on in a way that you kind of can't in Silicon Valley, just given how big it is. I find New York is somewhere in between. I think that the community, at least in the infrastructure world in New York, is relatively tight-knit because it's not quite as big as it is in San Francisco. At the same time, I find that people have much more perspective from other industries, because it's when you go to a cafe in New York, you're hearing people talk about media and art and finance and politics and many other things, as opposed to I'll sit at a cafe in San Francisco and what I hear about is JavaScript frameworks and databases.
I wonder, so like you also work closely with Glenn, which is like the managing partner, and what are some like core lessons that you feel like you've learned from like working with him?
Glenn's exceptional, and I think that what I've learned over time is that the relationships you build with founders are kind of the most important thing. Both if you want to be successful in this job, it's really about building meaningful and trusting relationships with founders so that you can be a sounding board to them, and so that ultimately they can be advocates for you as you try to build your career. So I think that's one really important component. I think the other one is patience. I think when I first joined, there were a lot of things that I was getting excited about. And there was a lot of things that I would bring to Glenn and be like, we have to do this. This is super interesting. And I think what he always preached to me is he's like, look, you don't get unlimited shots here. You got to figure out what do you really want. And especially, we're pretty careful around not investing in competitors. So if you think a space is really interesting, you need to make sure that we're backing the winner in the space. And so I think that's something that is always top of mind for me, especially as we just see more and more companies in this age of AI.
I feel like it's very hard because like you also don't know about the timing just because like there is a lot of different, or maybe you like this company but they went with someone else, like anything could happen. How do you balance out like the FOMO and like the, I guess like in general, like pull the trigger earlier than you should?
It's really hard. It's something that I think we struggle with every day. We try not to be victims of FOMO, but oftentimes when there's a lot of heat around something, it's reflective of something being special there. And so I think it's always a balance. I think that for us, we try to think about also kind of what's the size of the opportunity and as a result, like when do we think there's really 10x plus return potential? And so sometimes we'll do things that look crazy, a pre-revenue company at $100 million or $200 million valuation, but we have a lot of conviction in the team and in the size of the opportunity. And we know that, hey, like this valuation looks really high right now, but if we think there's an opportunity for a $5 billion plus company, it's not going to look high then. And we're willing to take that risk. And so I think always keeping that in mind and always kind of ensuring that we're focusing on, okay, is this a really big market? And is this a founder that we really, really believe in? I think that's what allows us to hopefully filter out what's real FOMO and really focus on the opportunities that we care about, even if they seem a little scary at the time.
Totally. Okay, so I want to end with a quick 1-minute fire round for you. What's your favorite book?
My favorite book, East of Eden.
Who would you invite to your dinner party?
I think Michael Jordan has just like always been my hero, so I'd love to meet him.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Glenn, without a doubt.
Where can we find you outside of work?
Gym, West Side Highway, walking around New York.
Oh, love. Okay. Well, Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such a very informative masterclass on infrastructure AI, I guess.
Thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Okay, let me quickly end stream.